Welcome everybody to the beginning of Intro to Theory and the end of the fundamental problems and core concepts at Theory Underground. That's right, this is part 12 of a series, but it's also the prelude or preface or prerequisite for what we are getting into with Intro to Theory. Not only that, it is the crash course of sorts that I want you to go through if you are interested in being a part of the reading group for the, let me read it, Post-Duopoly De-Radicalization Starter Pack. So post-Duopoly, it's really what this video is going to be all about. But then if you are interested in the de-radicalization from duopoly extremism, then you're going to be interested in this starter pack. It's a whole bunch of different books that sort of graduate you into different levels of the sort of deconstruction of being duopoly brained. And it does kind of assume that you're coming, like most people who are intellectuals, from a more like left side of things. So it's not a post-left reader, it is a post-duopoly de-radicalization starter pack. And if you are a member at TU, I will help you start a local discussion group, not some online thing where you're going to do Zoom calls with TU people. There will be a monthly discussion for each of the books, and I'm doing that in conjunction with Tony from One Dime, and some of that stuff is going to be on his podcast, some of it's going to be on my podcast, but that's neither here nor there because what matters is your local reading group and getting that started. Yes, you'll be able to participate in the thing that we all do, but preferably only after having already had discussions about it or in preparation to have discussions about it with your local reading group. And if you don't know anything about local organizing or how to get people together to do anything, then that's fantastic. I have over 20 years of experience and am happy to do that with you. I often say I have 15 years of experience doing that, but in reality, it's 20 if we include my time in the music scene. So yeah, with that said, I hope that you enjoy this lecture and yeah, welcome to Intro to Theory, as well as the post-duopoly de-radicalization process. Great to have you here.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment. Let's begin with an edgy joke. So the reason that I had to attend to something before we started this recording was because I had to put the wash into the dryer. And I was thinking, in a just society, would I have to do this? And from a traditional standpoint, the answer is no. My wife would do it. And in a progressive society, the answer is no. An immigrant would have to do it. All right, so that gets us going. Yeah, in a meritocracy, a person with a master's who is teaching and writing and researching has better things to do than his own laundry, right? From the neo-reactionary standpoint, I was cuckolding myself by doing my own laundry. From the progressive standpoint, this really just speaks to the fact that maybe my market value isn't really as high as I think it is. This might be a case of belonging to the falling professionals, right? In reality, I don't mind doing laundry. I think Michael Knowles, the conservative commentator, is silly when he boasts that he doesn't even know how to work the washer, right? He boasts about this. But this brings us to an important question about the nature of society and the norms that help us navigate our daily lives and the division of labor, not just in the workplace, but also within the domos or the home. And so an example of that obviously would be if you are living with, for instance, a spouse, the question of who does what is one that you cannot escape. And if you are more traditional, that makes it really easy, right? There's a sort of cookie cutter approach, and that saves you a lot of time and energy. I think a lot of norms come about from people trying to save time and energy, right? Norms are time savers if you just take them as givens. I think the work of Daniel Garner of O.G. Rose in Belonging Again is especially good for this. Constraints can be interpreted as givens because once taken as givens, they can sort of free you to not have to overthink certain things, and then you can get on your way. So norms can be huge time savers. Instead, if you go to progressive cities and then go to hip coffee shops, and I've done this way more than I would ever like to do again, you will guaranteed overhear a lot of conversations of people trying to navigate boundaries and expectations. It is the conversation happening in coffee shops outside of people who are basically gathering around a Bible. So it's like you're either gathering around a Bible and talking about that, or you are talking about your boundaries and expectations and how to maintain those either between yourself and the other person, or more likely talking about how you've been trying to do that with your spouse or your significant other or your partner or whatever they like to call it these days, right? Of course, people with a ludicrous amount of time, energy, privilege will then take that conversation to its ultimate point by introducing polyamory. And so they'll have their little polycule, and which makes it so that they have to talk about their boundaries and expectations 100 times more than they were already doing. And so that conversation about boundaries and expectations comes from the idea of DIY symbolic order. The DIY symbolic order is what happens when you cannot just accept as given a symbolic order and its norms, which is the more traditional approach. There's going to be problems either way, and you and I and everyone else, ultimately, we are forced to choose. And I would then add a complication, and that is to say that even if you are trying to choose a tradition, it does become like this big effort of trying to interpret that tradition into our contemporary situation. So it's never that simple, right? Unless you come from a family where things really just kind of worked, and your spouse comes from a family where things really just kind of worked, and there's more or less a coalescence between those two things. And it makes it a lot easier. You can kind of just take a lot more for granted. But for all of us who are doing the DIY symbolic order, washing the dishes becomes like this big issue. You know, taking out the trash becomes this big issue. And of course, what has happened in a society that is post-gender roles is that nobody knows how to change the oil on the car, and no one knows how to keep the house in order, right? So things that were traditionally gendered between men and women are now really just not taught for most people, right? And so that becomes an issue. And so in a sort of sense, we live in a non-binary world, but we're often not being realists about that fact, right? There's still a sex binary, but at the level of gender, things are very confused. I want to add some complexity by introducing the idea of being politically non-binary. And that's what I'll be coming out as here at the end of this talk. But for now, I want to back it up a bit and first talk about post-duopoly theory, critique, and practice. At the level of a theory, it's an understanding of the world that says, I am so over the duopoly. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are neither left nor right. It could mean that you are both and. It could mean that you're neither nor, or it could mean you're just left or you're just right, but you refuse to assume that the duopoly is natural, normal, and good, and you also don't lean into its reification. So what does that mean to reify the duopoly? basically just to take the norms of the duopoly for granted and not think deeply about them, right? So if I'm going to propose that there's such a thing as politically non-binary, I'm also going to say that there's such a thing as politically cis. You're politically cis, which just means that you take for granted your assigned political identity and you act like it is natural, normal, and good, as opposed to socially constructed, contingent, and performed. But before we get into all that, I want to step back and say something about critical theory. So critical theory is something that develops between Kant and Marx. It really reaches its sort of peak with Karl Marx when he says in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach that philosophers have only interpreted the world and the point is to change it. That's great. That's great. Now, critical theory after Marx becomes split between Lenin and Adorno. On the Lenin side of things, it's the 11th thesis on Feuerbach taken to a kind of extreme. It's hard to argue that it's an extreme version of that. Whereas on the other side, it's the sort of despair of that having not worked out, and also that having provoked the fascist reaction, which was terrifyingly successful in the grand scheme of things, resulting in Adorno's case, having to flee Germany and make his home in the worst country on earth, apparently, the United States, right? So Adorno comes here for safe haven, and famously, especially if you listen to conservatives, doesn't like it very much. You know, becomes one of the first real critics of the, not just advertising, but specifically culture industry. If Lenin is taking the idea that we must change the world seriously with his What Must Be Done and State and Revolution and stuff like that, well then, and obviously also with actual applications in terms of practice being like revolution, well then Adorno is on the other side of that, saying that did not work out, now what? And so for years, that has been the way that I describe it. Whenever people say, what is theory? They often kind of focus on one of those two sides. I always like to say that it really is a true fork. There is either we must change the world. We already kind of assume we know what must be changed. Or on the other side, yeah, we thought we knew, we tried, it didn't work out, now what? And usually it's not even now what. You'll notice there's nothing in Adorno that's like, now what? He doesn't even make that next step. He pretty much just focuses on, we're screwed. We're screwed. It didn't work. It didn't work. Let me tell you why it didn't work. No eye towards solutions at all, right? Well, that's kind of standard critical theory. That really encompasses the whole kit and caboodle, right? No, wrong, because it goes further. The historical genesis of critical theory develops through the 1960s and into the 1970s with what gets called post-structuralism, which is really just post-1968 burnout. If the post-left in America is something specific to a post-2016 through 2020 kind of burnout, and it is, that is exactly what it is, well then post-structuralism is something specific to post-1968, May 68 in France, where they shut down Paris. The workers, they got together, they shut it down, and the revolution really did nothing. It's like when Mark Fisher says, what if we had a protest and everybody came, in his capitalist realism? Well, it's kind of like, well, that is what happened in May 68. The workers and the students were able to work together enough to shut the city down, and then nobody could agree on anything. And the only people who really seemed to get a lot from it were like sort of situationist adjacent people who were doing performance art. or getting drunk on the street. Outside of them, what became of it? And so Foucault and Derrida, but also Lacan and Bourdieu, and then ultimately Baudrillard, and of course their little brother, Alain Badiou, all of them kind of come out as a response to that time. Lyotard potentially being the most canceled of them all. He was the most canceled because he wrote an evil book in which, did you just hold it up to the camera there, Luke? Did you hold up Lyotard? Hey.
Is this the evil book?
Which one is it? I can't see that.
No, it's an essay, The Postmodern Condition.
No, that's not the evil book. The evil book is the one where he talks about little girl Marx and how the worker likes his oppression. It's called Libidinal Economy. And in retrospect, later on, Lyotard referred to it as his evil book. And this was his way of sort of just kind of accepting the tremendous amount of backlash that it had garnered from people who were like, oh, damn, you really came out and said the quiet part out loud. Because everybody had given up on the working class, but then he just kind of came out and said it. And they were kind of mad at him for that. Ao said, hang on tight and spit on me. Yeah, it's a fun book, though. And I almost made a whole course based on it for next year. I was really excited to teach it, but there's priorities here, and I'm really excited about what's to come with 2026. So with that said, where are we at in this lecture? I have introduced the idea of politically non-binary. I teased you all with it. I'm saying that we're going to go deeper into that, and then I brought up the idea of post-duopoly theory, critique, and practice. But then before explaining what that really looks like, or how it works, or who its predecessors are, or how to do it, or how it cashes out in our lived reality, how it relates to large-scale structural change, or working with other people, or even just having a better life that is less unknowingly ideological, I wanted to first say all this stuff about what critical theory actually is, or has been. And so post-May 68, it goes beyond this split between Lenin and Adorno and becomes lowercase critical theories. Lowercase critical theories, the plural of critical theories, this is where everything wrong in the world is anti-blackness, or this is where everything wrong in the world is colonialism, or this is where everything wrong in the world is patriarchy, or this is where, you get the idea. Everything wrong in the world is that it's a height supremacy, right? Everything's built for tall people, but if you're short, then from your standpoint, you should be theorizing your firsthand experience because you have the authority of your firsthand experience, and you can talk about how everything's out of reach because you're a little guy, right? This is the direction I could have taken things. This was in an alternate universe. The Dave of pure ressentiment would have just been the theorist of height supremacy, right? Yeah, it would have been great. I didn't do it though, partially because nobody feels bad for short people. No one ever will. And the shorter you are, the funnier it is that you complain about it. So there's no hope for you. If you're a midget, that's hilarious. Oh, and you're offended that we think it's hilarious? Even funnier. This is just America. There's nothing we can do about it. I don't think it's just America. I think it's the world. There's just something about it. And so it's, height supremacy. What are you going to do about it? But similarly, and this is actually real, people can spend their entire undergraduate and then graduate studies focused on disability and how ableist society is. So I've laid out several different identity approaches. And all of these get sort of, how to say it, put on a pedestal and provided with a lot of grant funding by people who want to be woke. No. In reality, it's corporations who want to not get sued. They fund this stuff. So, sure, someone like Bill Gates might put some money in that direction. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation might put some money in that direction. But the corporations want to make sure they're not going to get sued. And so this stuff gets captured, these legitimate concerns gets captured as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was having a conversation recently where I said the thing that I've said a lot, but never in one of these lectures. And so I figure it's worth bringing in here. And that is that DEI fundamentalism always starts out with some basic, deep truth. And sometimes it's not very deep, but it's just like, oh, I didn't think of that. Oh, great point. Like, for instance, have you ever like walked around and like imagined how hard it is to get anywhere if you're in a wheelchair, right? Like, notice that none of the buildings have wheelchair ramps. So how is this, this institution, purporting to represent the people when it's not providing wheelchair ramp access? It's like, oh yeah. And then of course you can listen to someone give their TED talk about being in a wheelchair and how hard it is to get places. And you go, oh wow, yeah, great point. That's probably a bad idea. And then you find out that there were lawsuits. And you're like, oh, if I ever had a business, I'd have to make sure I'm not going to get sued. And so it's like, oh yeah. Okay, I need to take that seriously. And then, there's another good point that they'll often bring up, and that is the idea that there was a huge case, a very, very expensive case, where this engineering team put together a sensor so that you could put your hands underneath the water faucet in a bathroom and wash your hands. It would turn on automatically and you could wash your hands. There was a problem though. It only worked for lighter skin. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a problem. If you push go, and now all of the institutions across the country implement these automatic water dispensers, but all of a sudden it's not working system-wide for people who have darker skin, that sucks. My friend who has got a lot of tattoos, he said that this actually is a problem for his Apple smartwatch. He's white, but he's got an Apple smartwatch on his like basically black forearm, because he's kind of had the, he does what a lot of people are doing nowadays, which is he's had his tattoos completely covered up. And so it's just pure ink wall. And because of that, it creates problems for the Apple smartwatch. Well, the reason people bring this stuff up is because of the need for corporations and larger, especially public institutions, to be accessible to the public and to not needlessly or accidentally exclude people, leave people out, have people fall through the cracks. Totally. Okay. Yeah. Well, that all makes sense from a business standpoint. That all makes sense from a public administration or a city planning standpoint. And you don't have to be a Democrat or a progressive to be like, oh yeah, well, that's something to be aware of, and that's something that a good basic college education probably imprints you with, is like this understanding that there is the side of DEI that is just that. But what that morphs into, thanks to all of this funding, this corporate and just guilty privileged person funding into the humanities and social sciences, is the extremism of DEI fundamentalism. This is where it's not just about like, we got to cover our bottom line and be litigation proof and make sure that, these water faucets are going to work for everybody. This is where it gets into, no, society is inherently, in its bones, anti-Black, anti-woman, anti-disabled, anti-anyone but first world, right? And that approach, obviously popular to some extent, this kind of critical approach is somewhat popular to people on the right these days. You can look at James Lindsay's cynical theories as a great example of what I'm talking about, but there's also kind of a whole industry of popular bestsellers kind of focused on the divisiveness of identity politics and the sort of extreme cases that people are making about these things. Well, that extremism, it has its roots in this sort of basic business logic, but then it becomes this other thing once it starts being like, oh, we're radical now. We're radical because we're calling everything patriarchal, right? Well, intersectionality becomes the sort of next level, not even the intersectionality of a Kimberly Crenshaw, but specifically the way that that morphs through activist culture and DEI fundamentalism into, you just add all those things together. So it's a hetero, cis, normative, patriarchal, colonial, capitalist, you just go down the line, where every one of the lowercase critical theories and its fundamental dogma all get sort of bundled together into what I call loser fascism, or the fascism of losers, right? This was something that I rolled out at the Platypus Convention, where I talked about loser fascism. Loser fascism is the opposite of winner fascism. Winner fascism is what actual fascists from history attempted to do, which was say, let's take everything that works, bundle it up, and go with that, and create a new mythos about how those things go together. And so Mussolini would be the most famous example, since he wrote the piece called What is Fascism? And in that piece, he basically just says, take everything that works in your nation, bundle it up, make a new myth about it, and go hard. And so in his case, that meant, you actually want to, hold on to the Catholic Church, hold on to nationalism, hold on to the workers' movement. All three of those things are working. You just have to cut out the more universalist socialist angle that would make those workers prioritize Russia over Italy. You just have to cut out those religious sects within the church that are going to get in the way of the mainstream Catholicism. And you're just going to have to cut out any of the nationalist tendencies that are so anti-religious or socialist that they're not going to work with workers or Catholics, right? Like that would be winner fascism. I'm not saying that it's a winner because it's smarter or more moral or even that it actually worked. I'm saying it ideologically makes sense. You're saying, let's take the things that work for the most people and then just bundle those together, create a new mythos for it, and then be sort of totalitarian about that new mythos that caters to all of those majoritarian identities. Loser fascism is just doing the exact opposite. It's saying, okay, all of these different people are being forgotten. They're being excluded. They're not very well represented. People don't tend to want to center them for some reason or other. Well, let's just take all of them and bundle them together into one big thing and then hit everybody over the head with it and tell them that if they don't do it, they're bad. Like, it's suicidal. It's movement suicide. That's not to say that it's morally bad, but it's obviously not going to be on its face practical in the sort of way of trying to work with what has been working. Jen Pan gets into this origin of woke / DEI in corporate HR policies in the 80s and 90s. Jen Pan. Okay, good to know. Thank you. Great recommendation there, Matthew. All right, so I've given now this trajectory here for the first half hour that has spanned from Marx through to the lowercase critical theories that result in this sort of DEI fundamentalism that you find in the humanities and social sciences today. And now it's time to talk about a new kind of ideology critique. So in the standard critical theories ideology critique, what became the most important was not, say, the working class or the proletariat or whatever. It just became the oppressed. We care about the oppressed. And insofar as you are an intellectual, it is your job to write histories that focus on the oppressed, or to try to develop policies that will address the plight of the most oppressed. That became the thing in the 1960s onwards, right? Well, if that's what ideology critique became, setting aside the Žižekian tendency that I think has had a huge influence on me and probably a lot of you, which we will come back to later. I want to propose that there's another use for theory that is not just trying to figure out who's being the most oppressed or what to do about that. And that would be the critique of power itself and what keeps it reproducing itself. And specifically, the nature of power today. A way of saying that is the status quo. That's a way that people will refer to this. We want to understand how the status quo works so that we can resist it or so we can do something about it, right? Well, that language is a language that you may have noticed I don't tend to use because I think status quo always kind of says, in its colloquial meaning, something else. It says consensus reality. And implied in that is that there is like this mainstream thing that's held together, this consensus reality that's held together against which we resist or critique if we are on the fringe or trying to represent the people who are on the fringe. People who talk about centering a lot and inclusion are sort of duped by this. They just believe that there is like this mainstream and it's like a good life. We just have to bring more people into it. We just have to make sure that people have access to it. They're not kind of getting outside of all of that and kind of understanding what actually this status quo consists of. Well, today it consists of duopoly. Duopoly is one of the most powerful mechanisms of the reification of the system. And this was already true with Democrats and Republicans in the previous century. Because of the two-party system, duopoly was already a thing, but we entered a new era where the two sides stopped acting like they had so much in common after the threat of the Soviets was no more. The mainstream consensus reality held together by the two sides of the US political system and its duopoly has since then become a duopoly of extremes or an extremist duopoly. An extremist duopoly is very different from a consensus duopoly. The consensus duopoly says, well, on this one side, we have these good progressives, and on the other side, we have these good conservatives. And on the side of these good conservatives, there's guys like Ronald Reagan. And on the side of the good progressives, there's guys like Bill Clinton. And overall, there's this consensus, which is that markets need to work and that we need those markets to be able to expand everywhere. And that really just that's all that matters. Right? And it's just the neoliberal consensus reality. Okay. And really, I think, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton are kind of the archetypes of that old mode. And then, of course, Obama became kind of like, hey, maybe there'll be another Bill Clinton for this new century. But he and his presidency was ultimately sort of living through the tearing of America into these two extremes, where now it's not like, oh, well, we disagree. I'm left, you're right. We disagree, but there's a lot that we agree on and we can kind of work together on that. It became instead, no, you're the literal enemy. Obama is a literal communist. Trump is a literal, Nazi. Like this became the rhetoric. This became the extremes. So let's go to the guy who had the most to say as far as people writing in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s about our time today, and that was Jean Baudrillard. Okay, this is from his potentially most important work, The Symbolic Exchange and Death. He said, and this is just why I like to use the word duopoly, is because this is something that's always stuck with me. He says, it may seem that the historical movement of capital carries it from open competition towards oligopoly and then towards monopoly, that democracy moves from a multi-party system to a two-party system and then towards single-party rule. Oligopoly, or real duopoly, results from the tactical division of the monopoly. In every domain, duopoly is the completed stage of monopoly. It is not that a political will, state intervention, antitrust laws, etc., shatters the market's monopoly. Any unitary system, if it wants to survive, must find a binary regulation. Any system that wants to survive must find a binary regulation. This does not change anything as regards monopoly. On the contrary, power is only absolute if it is able to diffract into various equivalents, if it knows how to divide in order to become stronger. This goes for detergent brands as much as for a peaceful coexistence. Two superpowers are necessary in order to keep the universe under control. A single empire would crumble by itself. The balance of terror merely allows regulated oppositions to be put in place, for strategy is structural, never atomic. Even if this regulated opposition can be ramified into a more complex scenario, the matrix remains binary. And from now on, it will never again be a question of a dual or open competitive struggle, but one of couplets of simultaneous oppositions. That's up above in the chat here in the Zoom call for anybody present who wants to take a look at it. It's also quoted on the Substack post that I put out a few days ago called Post-Duopoly Critique, or Theory, Critique, and Practice. But with that said, yeah, duopoly thrives as a smarter monopoly, where each side depends on the other's worst version for existence. Well, okay, this is where we get into duopoly extremism. Okay, what Baudrillard just said was true in the 90s. It was true at the time of Bill Clinton. What I just said is now true. It's a different world in which we live, where each side depends on the other's worst version for its existence. Once you start to see this way, you won't be able to unsee it. But both sides thrive off of and require the other to be its worst possible self. Trump just kind of stood up and said, okay, fine then. Yeah, we're the worst. We're so bad. I'll just kind of just say whatever. We're so bad, yeah. Because it was already going on. And of course, by doing this, it's sort of like made more obvious what was already developing. What was already developing at the time of Trump and Bernie running. When Trump and Bernie both ran, the overwhelming majority of Americans were pretty unified on being sick and tired of both sides and of this lame sort of consensus reality where, they pretend to have these disagreements, but deeper down, it's just the elites, and they have absolutely zero interest in actually representing the people, right? And so people were rightfully disaffected by that. And because of the mainstream coverage of both Bernie and Trump, it became very obvious that the mainstream media was fake news. It became extremely clear. The division that you can kind of read about in Matt Taibbi's Hate Inc. became especially clear with the way that MSNBC and Fox News bifurcated over the last 20 years into these sort of extremes. And it is that extremism that I'm talking about when I say duopoly extremism, okay? And then DEI fundamentalism is just one side of that duopoly extremism that requires the other side to look something like patriarchal, to look something like sexist, racist, homophobic, ableist, whatever. Meaning that they go out of their way to watch for slips of the tongue or any little gesture that you might make, to try to spot the dog whistle, to try to be like, look, see how bad they really are? It's the conspiracy theorist mindset focused on trying to make the other side literally Hitler. And in terms of hyperstition, sometimes it works. Because along will come a Nicholas Fuentes who's going to say, fine, you're right. I don't care. The Jews do have too much of an influence on America. We're not really American first because obviously we're being Israel's little bitch. Obviously, this is indisputable. And also, they're castrating children. So, duh. Of course, we need a militant American first movement. We need to take what Trump has done and get it to the finish line. And also just say whatever it is that they say that we say. Confirm their worst fears, because in reality, it's their truest desire. The truest desire of the duopolistic extremist other is for you to just come out and say the thing that they keep trying to say that you are secretly believing or saying, right? Which is why progressive parents in blue cities across this land take their little kids to strip shows and give their kids money to put in the G-strings of strippers who literally are doing provocative, sexy dances and stripping down into their thongs and then gyrating their bare buttocks on children. This is not a one-off, guys. If you are not based and post-duopoly pilled like me, meaning that you don't follow both sides of the culture war, then you might not be aware that this is happening all the time. It's happening all the time. And if you point it out or say anything about it, people get all like, oh, well, shouldn't children be exposed to different things? And it's like, what are you talking about? There's all kinds of things children should be exposed to. Why is that the thing? And if you're like David from Theory and Philosophy, and you see me pointing this thing out, then you'll say, what are you trying to say? Which is what happened. So if you guys are unaware, that's a much bigger channel in the Theory and Philosophy space. It's called Theory and Philosophy. He's a nice professor, but he's a lib-cucked kind of guy who is not capable of seeing when his side is playing into duopoly extremism. He's not capable of it. Not yet. You know, the chances are anywhere between tomorrow and 10 years from now, he will likely change his tune, as will a lot of people. A lot of people who are currently participating in this madness could change. I'm a person who was participating in this madness who has changed. As a person who was actively participating in the culture war, taking a left reductionist position, a left fusionist position, well, they're the lesser evil kind of position. I have to take full responsibility for that and say, you know what? That was a bad idea. I regret the extent to which I did participate in that. And it's sobering to think back to how me being genderqueer and non-binary back in 2018 actually sort of stoked the flames of reaction of the people who are aware that this is a slippery slope to bad things, as well as normalizing on the left this sort of genderqueer thing, which if it was going to happen the way that I thought it should happen, would have been fantastic. It would have meant that everybody just kind of gets over this stuff and takes it less seriously. right? If for where I was at, I was just like, this is non-binary is a sort of like anti-identity politics position. I'm essentially saying your identity as being super masculine or super feminine is kind of a silly cartoon and you should be over it. That was kind of what non-binary meant to me. There were other people, though, actively turning it into like a new thing. And it was becoming a thing that requires a regimen of hormones and surgeries. And that's where I was like, but wait a second, what is that? And if you do follow both sides of the culture war and you actually listen to detransitioners, it's absolutely heartbreaking what that results in. And then people like Thought Slime and Lance from the Surfs and Vosh and Hassan Piker and now Mondani, these kinds of guys will just kind of act like, well, a couple of people are going to get chewed up and spat out or done dirty by the system, but the overwhelming majority of people who are having their identities affirmed through this surgical, pharmaceutical, and psychiatric intersection of industries are being served well by this. Statistically, they're less likely to kill themselves now. When, of course, those statistics are debated all the time, there are signs that that actually is not true, that the risk of suicide does not go down if you transition. And also, if you follow the Dead Name Substack, then there's a new person every week who transitioned. It just took them deeper into their dark place, and then they off themselves. So it's a very dark situation. I'm not saying that it's not potentially beneficial for somebody. It could be. I'm open to it, the fact that it could be. But DEI fundamentalism is so fixated on being ahead of the curve on what is currently hip in social justice circles that they're willing to throw detransitioners under the bus. And they're willing to throw under the bus people who have concerns, people who are noticing, right? It's a big problem, and it really breaks my heart. And insofar as this sort of post-gender thing was not co-opted, but directly feeding into the intersection of these three industries, the surgical, pharmaceutical, and psychiatric, it really is concerning and heartbreaking. And look, if everybody was like Jacob here at Theory Underground, which, he's anti-trans medicalist, well, then that would be great. But that is not what the mainstream institutions are doing. The person that Joe Biden gave Woman of the Year to, Dylan Mulvaney, said that her nose job was life-saving. When you're saying that your nose job is life-saving, you are reifying a narrative that is being shoved down the throats of children who are approaching or going through puberty, which is essentially this: if you don't get the commodities, which is to say services, from these industries, then you're going to kill yourself. And if your parents don't try to help you in that endeavor, and if they don't affirm your identity, well, then they're trying to kill you too. Your blood is actually on their hands. And that's super upsetting to me, because as a rebellious kid who had those kinds of ideas, I would have gone for that. And I would have just been like, oh yes, my parents want me dead. Right? And also it probably could have goaded me on to actually doing the dirty deed, right? To take your own life is one thing when it's done against the entire symbolic order. It's another thing when one side is telling you that it's genuinely emancipatory in the sense that you are resisting people who won't affirm you. The entire cultural left side of the duopoly extreme today, like this is part of their extremism, is telling children, oh, you'll commit suicide if people don't all get behind you whenever you say you are whatever you are, right? Yeah, I'm concerned by that. I'm also concerned by the rise in sort of this I'll put it like this. Reaction, right? I think that you can be a part of reaction on the right without it being the worst thing ever. For instance, I think that a doctor who cuts off functioning genitals from a child is worse than Nicolas Fuentes. Because Nicolas Fuentes is just saying things. He's not doing things. So there's a big difference between saying a racist thing or whatever and literally cutting off functioning body parts of a person who is going to, 2 to 5 to 10 years later realize, oh, but what if I do want kids? Oh, wait a minute. I was just misdiagnosed. I'm actually just autistic. Oh, I was misdiagnosed. I'm actually just gay. And I was taking my sexual orientation to be like this huge thing that I had to make a decision on because I was in high school and it was very difficult. But now I'm trying to move on in my life and grow up, and I can't do that. So yeah, somebody messaged me on Instagram and was like, to put Nicolas Fuentes on this thumbnail alongside a drag queen dancing for children in a thong like that, there's no comparison because what Fuentes is calling for is so much worse. And, is that an edgy take for me? I don't really think it's an edgy take to say that it's worse to cut off the body parts of children than it is to say a bad thing. Like, you can say all of the bad things all of the time. There's a difference between saying those things and doing bad things. Okay, that's my basic point here. But this is, for me, a position that is won or wrested from a long process of ideology critique in the era of duopoly extremes or duopoly extremism. And it's not a position that I think everyone will want to have, right? You're not necessarily going to want to agree with me. It would be a dangerous thing in some places, in some social networks, to agree with me. For instance, we have a detransitioner at Theory Underground who will not talk about it publicly because that would result in exclusion from the party scene where they live. But this is a person who used to write publicly about being on hormones and using pronouns and all of this stuff. Now that person has detransitioned, but is living in secret, essentially, not talking about it because they would be excluded from the party scene. People say you should listen to trans people. I have. And I also was genderqueer. But besides that, I had a lot of trans friends. There's not that many, supposedly. There's not that many. But in reality, I had quite a few. And they've all detransitioned except for one in the last 10 years. All of them. So that's crazy. And then the one who hasn't detransitioned can't go outside, can't look at screens, can't hear audio that is grating, and literally is so hypersensitive to anything that it all results in migraines, and literally spent 2 months last year laying in a dark room. Couldn't go to work, couldn't look at the phone, just laid in a dark room for 2 months. That's the one trans friend who's still on the hormones. Okay. My best previous trans friend detransitioned but stayed on the hormones for 3 years because it was so rough to come off of the hormones. It was so difficult to come off of them that he was staying on them. And also, for those 3 years, kept using she, her pronouns just because it was like a awkward thing to have to encounter, because he had, while initially transitioning, had become a really big part of the movement in Idaho to add the words for gender and sexuality to the anti-discrimination bill. So the movement to add the words was this movement for which he, at some point, identifying as she, had become not just a big advocate, but actually gave like a very compelling speech, brought a lot of people to tears, right? And now, years later, walking it back, was still kind of using the pronouns, was still on the hormones, even though in private conversations was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. This has had a huge impact on me. Having nieces who are on TikTok and who have body image issues, as most teenagers, especially girls, do, who are then thinking that, oh, well, maybe it's the trans thing, right? This is something that makes me feel morally aware and alive, right? But it's something where people will say, oh, well, if you talk about it, you are feeding into the reaction. You are buying into the right-wing boogeyman. You are throwing trans people under the bus. Okay. Similarly, if you were on the right and you're not denouncing Nick Fuentes, then people will assume that you actually support him. I take Fuentes to be a lot less concerning personally than what is literally happening with ICE. So, I'm not anti-border, and that alone can get you canceled, as Tony from One Dime found out pretty recently. You can all go watch and listen to him talking about that with Benjamin Studebaker on One Dime Radio. Or if you want to go to a more classic case from like 10 years ago, you can watch when Angela Nagel made her case, her leftist case for borders in Jacobin. It was a very controversial article then. And in both the cases of Nagel and Tony from One Dime, what you have is a leftist who's becoming aware of the fact that if you say the common sense part out loud that Bernie Sanders said many times, and that Obama said many times, and that Bill Clinton also believed, if you just say the common sense part about how, yeah, in order to have a nation, in order to maintain state security, yeah, you're going to have a border. And also the Koch brothers and the laissez-faire capitalist libertarian types are the ones who want to get rid of the borders. If you say that part out loud, well, now you're a neo-reactionary or a crypto neo-reactionary, you're a fascist. So I say all of this before my condemnation of ICE, just so that you know, yeah, no, I'm not going to be loved by the people who are typically anti-ICE. Like most of the people who are anti-ICE would have a problem with everything that I just said, because I obviously think that you would be wasting all of your time and energy and efforts in being anti-border. It's about as ridiculous as abolishing the police. Okay, that is the kind of slogan that you utilize or employ when trying to egg on or incite reaction as a way of kind of proving your point. Like if you can get people to react in a silly way, then it proves your point. And so then you advocate with for your cause with repellent, divisive, and sensational sloganeering, right? So with all that said, ICE is literally kidnapping people. And the people who supposedly care about small government don't care about that. So not only have the progressives in my life lost the plot to the point where they just can't imagine there being an issue with cutting the genitals off of a child, or not or putting them on a sort of chemical castration regimen. On the right, they're literally rationalizing and supporting abducting people off of the street. Not just abducting people, but you can now we're talking about a sort of pseudo law enforcement wearing masks, ski masks, literally like Antifa. No badges, no warrants, just showing up like thugs, grabbing people off the street. That's absolutely insane. Yeah, I agree that the situation has gotten ridiculous with the drug cartels. And I agree that we really don't know how many people live in this country and that there's all kinds of people missing from the census and that there's entire areas of cities that have become unsafe to go into and that there's like, yeah, this is no joke. The drug cartels will skin your face. They will literally make videos of cutting the skin off of your face and bleeding you out as you scream on camera. That's what the drug cartels do. That's real. And they're in a neighborhood near you. That's real. Something does have to be done. Totally. That's called the job of the FBI, though. And that has nothing to do with abducting random people trying to go to work or trying to finish out their papers in the immigration office. That has nothing to do with that. And so, yeah, I'm morally outraged by this one as well. It's a moral issue. I don't know if it's a political issue. It's a moral issue. And too many of the Marxists or people who care supposedly about large-scale structural change in my life will say that this is just moralizing. I don't care what they think, right? They have, especially if we're talking about the left that just cares about large-scale structural change, enabled and reified duopoly extremism about as much as humanly possible by downplaying and dismissing the stuff that happens on both sides of the culture war, but usually on the left side of the culture war because they are captured by a leftist big other and they capitulate to it, they pander to it, and ultimately they worship at its careerist altar. That's my real thoughts on the matter. But I don't expect this to be a popular position, and I don't mean it to. I'm not trying to start a large-scale structural movement of people who are going to organize around being post-duopoly. I just think that it's a useful way to identify when I'm talking to people who take as default and then pander to the norms of either side of the duopoly, those norms that have been captured and reproduced so as to drive on and incite the absolute worst kind of reaction from the other side. So when we talk about ideology critique having like this legacy, really it starts with Kant. I mean, you could say it starts with Descartes, questioning everything, hyperbolic doubt. But then with Kant, with the categories of the mind, filtering reality, do we even have access to the things themselves? The ideology of rationalism versus empiricism as something that he is getting over and above through his approach to critique, which then becomes something else in Hegel and then ultimately reaches this new level through Marx. And then he wants to change the world with immanent critique, right? And so through that, we get this idea of critical theory, and then critical theory splits between Lenin and Adorno, and then it becomes, after May 68, lowercase critical theories, not because of the post-structuralists. It's not their fault. It's not Foucault's fault. It's not Derrida's fault. It's the fault of literary critics and sociologists in the United States. It's their fault. It's not the fault of the French theorists. It's the fault. I mean, Bourdieu and Foucault would have definitely seen how DEI fundamentalism is nourishing and sustaining this age of duopoly extremism. So it's not their fault. It is the fault of stupid American professors who are so caught up in going and teaching this watered down theory and then going home and watching MSNBC. Like, that's basically what it boils down to. That's what they do. Or they go and they read The Guardian or what have you. But now we turn to the three levels of ideology critique, and this is the part where I can say something quickly about the Žižekian approach that has been such a big influence on this development. Scapegoating is something you can't understand, not in a deep way, without Slavoj Žižek, or at least the work of people who are profoundly impacted by the work that he has been doing with the Ljubljana school. Okay? But scapegoating ultimately boils down to not like an implicit or an explicit level of the ideology. It's not like, oh, look at these people. They keep saying these bad things about the Jews. let's focus on the explicit things that they're saying about the Jews. They say the Jews control everything. Is that really true? Let's fact check it. That would be the explicit level. The implicit level would be like, oh, they keep talking about the globalists, but what they really mean is the Jews, right? This is what people do when they focus on the explicit or the implicit levels of ideology, okay? But then there's the obscene underside. Okay, so you have the explicit, you have the implicit, and then there's the obscene underside beneath both of those semantic levels, where it's not about semantics at all, but about a libidinal economy, and specifically the way that your desire and your drive are existing on this sort of dialectical or cybernetic loop. Okay, so in this sort of cybernetic feedback loop, your desire and your drive are constantly playing into each other. The desire for the pleasure principle and the drive to undermine. Your desire to be perfect and your drive to undermine perfection. Your desire to live up to your ideal ego or your ego ideal, and your drive to do things that result in symbolic suicide. The drive in this sense, as death drive, has to do with the obscene underside. So both the left and the right are going to have ideals that they believe in. God, family, nation, that would be the right side, versus the universal truth and equality and compassion on the left side. These are ideals. They're fantastic. And we can look at the explicit level and whether that's genuinely the best thing to be prioritizing in both a moral, ethical, or politically practical, pragmatic, or strategic sense. We can talk about what's going on there. But then we can look at the implicit level and how, for instance, DEI fundamentalism actually is all about excluding people who are a part of the majority. It's all about punching just your average white guy, for instance. Like that would be an approach that people on the right will take. Whereas, and notice the way that white woman or white girl has become pejorative. That's all part of the same thing, right? So that would be that's implied, right? It's implied. Well, what's implied by country, God, family, in whichever order you put those. Well, there's all kinds of things that are implied, such as other people don't matter, or people who don't adhere to and uplift or center those three things are enemies within, right? So you can see that's implied in this sort of chauvinistic approach. Okay. Well, what I just did was I showed you how both the ideals of the left and the right, the two sides of the duopoly, good things, undeniably, which you can then think about critically at the explicit level, have their sort of implied sides. And a thing that critical theory will do is kind of say, well, they say this, but in reality, what they mean is this. That is the standard ideology critique approach. Okay. The Žižekian influenced approach is going to say, no, we care about the obscene underside. Where does death drive come into play? What is the libidinal economy of these speech acts? So for instance, it's not just, America first is on the explicit side, and then on the implied side, everyone else sucks and we're superior. No, not at all. It's the scapegoating of the immigrant. It's the scapegoating of the person who's a traitor, or the person who's the enemy within. And the scapegoating, you say you care about God and Christianity and love and grace and freedom and family. But in reality, like, you're not losing any sleep about kids being put in cages. All of a sudden, it's just like, well, grace and freedom. You know, got to break some eggs to make an omelet. These kids are being put in cages. Oh, well. Well. But where's the drive come in? The drive comes in with getting off on it. It's not exactly the same thing as, how do you say the word? Schadenfreude. Is that how you say the word, Luke?
Yeah, pretty Schadenfreude. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the same thing as that. It's related to that. When we use that term, though, it's like too literal. It's like you're actually enjoying it, which is very different from suffering from it, but getting off on the suffering about it. Okay, so that's a very different thing. The kind of enjoyment that I'm talking about is the enjoyment of road rage. Nobody I've ever seen who's road raging would admit that they're getting off on it. You know, they're just upset that everyone else doesn't know how to drive. So at the explicit level, they have a justification for why they're doing what they're doing. But at the obscene underside of the road rager, they're getting off on it. And, you know, with this theory of repression and sublimation, which Lacanians want to get all nuanced about, and I get mixed reports from different Lacanians. I'm just going to put it the way that I think makes sense. Look, you are not able to just do anything that you want to, and you have to learn how to say no to some of your desires. And your drive is a rebellious thing that develops in relation to that. Okay, that's what we're talking about. And it develops all of its own kinds of outlets that get called cathexes. Okay, and if your way of getting off on something is related to drive, it's probably because it undermines you. It undermines that ideal ego that you strive for in your more sober and inspired times. It also undermines your ability to work with other people, and it also makes you look ridiculous. The right obviously looks ridiculous when it goes from saying it cares about God's guns and freedom, but then turns right around and doesn't seem to have any issue with the fact that actual American citizens get unlawfully detained without warrant, taken off the street by people with no badge, people literally wearing masks, right? Now, there's all kinds of ways that I can go deeper into the two sides of the duopoly. It's not just on the one side ICE and on the other side castrating children. There are other extremes. Abortion is an extreme. It's actually an extreme. From the standpoint of probably over 5 billion people on this planet would be floored to hear that it's nearly a third of Generation Z that has been aborted. Like, floored, right? But if you're just kind of like a modern, progressive, liberal subject, well, those are not real lives. Really, all you're talking about is the choices made by women. And it's like, yeah, cool. But also, if you look at things pluralistically and try to imagine how that appears from an outsider's position, if you actually were to kind of practice a little alien anthropology, just try to imagine what it's like from someone else's position who doesn't hold to your secular, naturalistic, modern take on things. Yeah, if you tried that, you're going to realize it looks a lot like infanticide and child sacrifice on the altar of individualism. It's hard not to see that when you look at it from the overwhelming majority of people on the planet's position. Okay. And the reason I invoke the overwhelming majority is because it actually matters if you care about large-scale structural change. If you think that you're so progressive, but you leave behind the overwhelming majority of people to the point where now we can't harness automation so that people can have more time, energy to spend with their kids or develop their talents so they could be creative and live a passion-driven life, well, then it's a problem all of a sudden, isn't it? And this becomes a sort of black pill once you start to sit with it, which is where we sort of transition now from the first part of the lecture to the second part. The black pill is the black pill that I took basically between 2019 and 2021. In 2020, I left politics, I left the academy, and I left Theory Plebe, my YouTube channel, and I closed down my Patreon, and I wrote in the introduction to Waypoint, my first book, that I agreed with Elliot Rosenstock's black-pilled point about how far gone America actually is. America's completely screwed. No change can happen here. You're best to just move to some other country. Like, that was his position. And I said, I agree, except that I don't think leaving is going to help. And the reason I don't think that leaving is going to help is because I'd already at that point traveled enough to know that American culture gets exported everywhere. American culture is our #1 export in the US. And insofar as other countries get to think that they are better than the US, it's because they are comparing themselves to that export. It's an export that they rely on watching. It's a spectacle that they rely on so that they can feel like their own political system's not that bad, at least. It's a very sensational, sportsified kind of politics that obviously is backwards and leads to nowhere. And by being enamored by that spectacle, you get this sort of cheap sense of intellectual or moral superiority. It's like the #1 thing about the Canadian identity is, well, at least we're not America. And it's like, that's true. Good job. At least you got something going for you besides maple syrup and being nice, or saying sorry the way that I do, because I am ultimately the child of Canadians. So, okay, so with all of that said, then, we get off on trying to find the worst versions of the opposition, reducing and totalizing the opposition as the absolute worst thing, trying to hyperstition into reality the opposition becoming that thing, and in so doing, we kind of just get this sort of default superiority, right? And so I gave up on the whole situation. I called it ideological gerrymandering at the time of the introduction to my book, Waypoint. So I said, I agree with Elliot Rosenstock, and I take it much further. It's not just because America is so anti-intellectual and reactionary. It's also because everyone is so ideologically gerrymandered, which I was starting to also think of as psychological gerrymandering. And the reason I was thinking about psychological gerrymandering is because I was thinking about how, if you pay attention to the work of, especially the early work of George Lakoff or Jonathan Haidt, you'll see that there's all this stuff coming out of psychology about how basic personality types are being politicized. I mean, it's gotten even more extreme than that, where now if you go work out, it's coded as right-wing. It's like a right-wing thing to go work out. So it's also, I've seen now a right-wing thing to use supplements at all, like vitamins. And so actually when I went to the Other Life retreat, which is kind of tech right, and that was when Matthew Stanley organized it and invited me as a speaker. And I got to meet some of the people there, including Mosey, who some of you met at the Theory Underground retreat. It was true. In the morning, they were all like doing their little supplements thing. And I was like, it's true. I didn't I didn't know that it was real. And I actually was like, I need to start doing that. Not because I want to be right, but because it seems like probably smart to, and Mosey actually made the recommendation because I was waking up and feeling groggy all of a sudden. And he said, well, he said, well, are you taking magnesium? And so I started doing the amount that he recommended, and it literally made a difference. And I was like, okay, that's great. I'm feeling more alive in the morning. And so now, I'll actually hold it up here and show you guys. This is like, look out. Probably the most controversial thing that I'm going to show you all. This is like basically a dog whistle. Look at this. I have my regimen of vitamins. Ooh, right wing. Someone said the jujitsu to reaction pipeline is real. And they said that because I was wearing a jujitsu gi while driving home from jujitsu in the morning, and I'd made some video. And so they said that in the comments. Well, back in 2020, I wasn't thinking about how supplements and exercise or self-defense gets coded right. I was thinking about how the priority of security itself gets coded as right, or the priority of strength and control and discipline and courage, like all of that stuff gets coded as right. Whereas on the other side, a priority of openness to new experiences and empathy and equality, like those sort of priorities get coded left. That's what I was thinking about at the time, and I was thinking about how that's not sensible at all. If you looked at any other time in human history, those things were not considered mutually exclusive, but those things have become somehow ideologically captured. So you've got these basic psychological profiles that prioritize one over the other getting ideologically captured. What's going on here? I called that psychological gerrymandering. And I said, I am so black-pilled over it that I'm going to stop worrying about trying to influence anybody today and just focus on developing myself and giving myself time. And by giving myself time, I get to become a person who's not pandering to or capitulating to or centering this ideologically and psychologically gerrymandered duopoly, or either side of it. So I wanted to sort of denature myself from its norms. And I gave myself how did I say it? I gave myself basically 30 years. But I said, I'm going to give myself 5 years to write a book to the parents the kids will be 25 in 30 years. And so now that it's 5 years later, that really just means the kinds of kids being born around this time, the kids who are kind of give or take a few years turning 25 in 2050. Like that's who I serve as an educator. It's not just like lifelong education for adults, but specifically like how do we develop ourselves as adults to be something more than those caught up in arrested development, to become something more than the ideologically, psychologically, and attunement kind of gerrymandered consumer subjects that have really nothing to offer to future generations. How do we develop ourselves to actually have something worth saying to those people who will be becoming adults in 2050? What do we do? What's the best way from here? How shall we proceed? And so for me, part of it is to just give up on the duopoly extremism. But that doesn't look the same as it looks to the sort of class first, large-scale structural change types of leftists. For them, they say that they're doing that by not focusing on the culture war at all. They think that they're above and beyond all of that. Well, I would say that they're totally possessed by it, and they totally defer to and capitulate to and center the left side of that duopoly. Overwhelmingly, the majority of the time, that is what they're doing. Even if they're like Chris Catrone and they spend a lot of time watching Fox News to try to understand what's going on right now, because he tends to speak to people who are coming from the left side of things, and because he tends to speak to college students, his big other ultimately that he performs for and that he centers and that he capitulates to, it is still that leftist big other. And therefore he reifies one side and enables duopoly extremism. Okay. And I don't mean to throw him under the bus. I like this guy. I like him quite a lot. And I see him as a great organizer and professor. And I think that all great professors, if they have any sort of influence today, have to do what I just described. And he would agree with me and has agreed with me before, both publicly and privately. He has to do this because this is his target audience, the students of today. I don't want the students of today to be my target audience. That's the difference. I want to buy myself time to then speak to their kids and say, your parents lost the plot. And so I realized I wanted to give myself time to grow the fuck up because I knew your parents were not going to grow up. That's the kind of book that I will get to write. And so when people are like, oh, you're going to alienate people, what people? Which people are you talking about? You're talking about people I already gave up on. You can't tell me that I'm going to alienate this future generation because they're not here yet. And we don't know who they are or what they're going to be like. And in the meantime, we can focus on developing ourselves and honing our voices and our understanding of the situation. And more important, ways of living that help us denature or deconstruct all of that pure ideology. Right? And we can do that through socioanalysis, through alien anthropology, through the critique of the post-class fractured mass, through understanding beyond ideology and psychology, the gerrymandering of Befindlichkeit itself, not just of attunement, but of the always already being attunedness of the human, and how that's inextricable from modal understanding against a horizon of possibilities and the whole symbolic order that you're thrown into. And in that sort of classic sort of thing I just outlined here, where Befindlichkeit is equiprimordial to Verstehen and Rede, right? These German words for basically, in Heidegger's use, modal understanding and the symbolic order or discourse, right? Also, this always already attunedness. I hate to use these words. That's why I prefer to just say Befindlichkeit. But the point is like when those are all equiprimordial, well, what's the discourse? What's the symbolic order? It is the duopoly. We don't know what life was like prior to duopoly extremism. We've all been thrown into it. We've all developed within it. All of our coping mechanisms are grounded in it, right? And so some of us, our coping mechanism is to tune it all out. Some of us is to just consume culture war content from the left or from the right, just one-sided, and tell ourselves, well, I know I'm getting off on this, and I probably shouldn't, and I shouldn't probably build my personality around it, and I probably shouldn't make it my main thing because it's just like react sort of rage bait content that I'm addicted to. Right? That is an approach. And I think that people will assume that being post-duopoly at the level of practice, especially when we start saying politically non-binary, what they're going to think that means is no war but class war. We can just bracket out the culture war. We don't have to take seriously the culture war at all. And I'm like, why? So that you'll be remembered as a person who sat on the sidelines and didn't say anything when they were cutting the genitals off of children or snatching American citizens off of the street and unlawfully detaining them? How does that benefit you? Why don't you actually tune in and pay attention to both sides? Being post-duopoly doesn't mean you're better than the duopoly. It doesn't mean you don't get off on the duopoly. It doesn't mean that you don't tend to take a side in the duopoly. I still tend to take a more leftist, progressive, secular side in the duopoly. I'm just a lot more agnostic about everything. And I'm very well aware that there's going to be people who, they might have a point. They might be right about something. I actually don't know. I should probably take heed, pay attention. and that my positions might change on some things. Because being non-binary doesn't mean that you don't have masculine or feminine aspects to you. It means you probably have both, but you also put a big question mark over all of these stereotypes. Like, for instance, is being a woman about being catty, flirtatious, and putting on a performance of always kind of being dumb and just kind of deferring to the man? If you're Alenka Zupancic or Judith Butler, that is what being a woman is. If you're Natalie Wynn or Abigail Thorne, that is what being a woman is. Okay. Or is being a woman about sort of having this sort of huge urge to nurture, care for, and tend to life itself? In the latter case, if that is traditionally coded as feminine, it's obviously something that men benefit from being in touch with. It's not just about men need to be in touch with their feelings. It's about, no, men need to learn how to nurture, tend to, and care for, right? And so in this sort of like academic PMC girl boss approach to what the woman is, it gets reduced to like a prop for the male ego. And then, of course, people want to challenge that, and rightfully so, because that's lame. But of course, in the sort of deeper sense of it being about nurture itself, well, that's nothing to throw out. In fact, everything about capitalist modernity and also state control wants you to seed that sort of urge to nurture life, seed it to either corporations or public institutions. Both sides want you to seed that and then go just get a real job. Just go get a real job and forget about life. Go get a real job, chase money, be plastic. That's what it's really all about. And when gender has been dumbed down to such an extreme, of course people are going to rebel against it. And of course I did, because that's ridiculous. I grew up in a world where if you don't kill a deer, you're not a real man. And I was like, I mean, I would kill a deer, but now that you said that, I'm not going to, because fuck you. You can't tell me what to do. And this was kind of my attitude. It was like, I'm not going to kill a deer just to prove that I'm a real man. I'm not interested in proving jack shit to you, because like that kind of attitude just pisses me off, right? So, I mean, I was challenging these norms even back then as a kid, as a teenager. But that chip on my shoulder about gender norms and stereotypes only grew with time. And I challenged it during the MySpace era by wearing eyeliner and doing all that stuff that all of the Metro kids were doing. And then, of course, like that stuff grew into this genderqueer thing. And that was also great, because it's challenging the cartoons that we're supposed to fit ourselves into, these sort of cookie cutters that we're supposed to fit ourselves into. Well, to take non-binary in this sort of sense seriously is to say that there's parts of me that are feminine, there's parts of me that are masculine. Some of the parts of me that are masculine need to be toned down a little bit. Some of the parts of me that are masculine need to be nurtured. Same with the parts of me that are feminine. Some of those need to be nurtured. Others need to be squelched, right? Like probably shouldn't like overthink things and wrap myself up into neurotic pretzels because Becky said that, right? Like it's a stereotypically like girl thing to do. And there's a way that a guy can spiral out on that shit too. And it's just not great, right? And it's not great for women. It's not great for men, but it is sort of considered a sort of feminine thing to get caught up in that sort of neurotic socialite behavior. So this is about taking a sort of radical responsibility for finding the good and nurturing the good, whether it's masculine or feminine, and at the same time, finding those aspects that are holding you back and doing what must be done to overcome. So like masculinity has its own kind of anger, and femininity has its own kind of anger. And I have experienced both. And I can find myself in the grip of anger, and it can kind of spiral out in a sort of masculine or feminine way. Both are petulant. Both are immature. Both are a dead end. Anger is not the solution to anything, right? And a certain kind of resentment mongering working class ideology tells us that, well, it's just like a blue collar thing to be like a braggadocious kind of guy and to kind of put out like this front and all this kind of stuff. And there's like this sort of intellectual, more effeminate kind of guy who's like above all that, but also it's kind of not in your nature to say anything or ever like go out on a limb or really, do anything courageous, right? So it's a really convenient position for the effeminate male. And so this brings us to virtue ethics and the importance of sort of countering the tendency that comes most naturally to you and going out of your comfort zone. And if you're naturally predisposed towards being brash and overly masculine, maybe like tone it down. Whereas if you're on the other side and you're like an effeminate pussy, maybe like you should probably go out of your comfort zone and like stand up for yourself sometimes, okay? It's okay. You can do that, work on it, right? This is what I'm getting at with non-binary. This is what I was always getting at with non-binary. And it applies to conservative and progressive too. You can say conservative and liberal or traditionalist and progressive, or those words become synonymous. Unless you're talking to historians or political theorists who are super based in history, who then like to say, well, the real left is this one thing, which is to say it cares about equality and it's anti-hierarchy and it has its like roots in this tradition going back to the French Revolution and the right's on the side of reaction and it wants to go back to the monarchy or it wants to go back to the 1950s. This is the sort of intellectualist account that can't see the world in which we live and doesn't understand itself to be participating in the age of duopoly extremism and thinks that it can just be lefter than thou while, this, and I did write a piece about this in Underground Theory Volume 1 called Lefter Than Thou, where it's basically just saying like that whole intellectualist account of like, well, the real left is this, is just like a way of evading the real situation that I'm laying out. It's a way of trying to evade it while at the same time setting yourself up as a residential expert because you read a bunch of books. And so now you can tell people what left really means. And then you can tell progressives and Democrats, well, if you really cared about equality, if you really cared about oppression, if you really cared about injustice, well, then you do it the way that I do it. This is what lefter than thouism kind of results in. Same thing with people who try to reform Christianity, especially the progressive people who try to reform this sort of idiot version of Christianity that is so popular in America. If you care a lot about something and it has a rich historical tradition, then one thing that you can do is to try to influence it to become its better self. And so trying to reform socialism and the left more broadly means that you're also trying to tell Democrats and progressives, here's what the left really is. And the same thing I would then say with if you're trying to get people to be real Christians, right? Well, I also know people who try to reform the right. And so they want it to be more mature and its best self as well. And that's great. It's great that you found your side that you think is ultimately correct in the grand scheme of things, and you want to try to get your side to be its better self. But is the way you try to get your side to become its better self necessarily scapegoating and getting off on the opposition being its worst possible self? If you read a progressive reformer or a leftist, a real leftist, TM, they'll do this thing where they're like, oh yeah, well the right's just terrible. Oh yeah, well the right's just racist. But we know better. And then we do this and we do that. And when we really care about justice, what we really do is this, that, and the other thing. It's this in-group, out-group thing. It is we're holding ourselves together by scapegoating that other that has been reduced to its worst possible representation. And we have probably, to have this sort of common sense approach, curated that common sense by a lot of media content that picks out the absolute worst or frames as the absolute worst things that weren't really that bad in the first place, but tries to take them out of context and make them the absolute worst. It's either one, probably a lot of both all of the time. And that's how you nourish and reproduce the constitution of your little bubble within which this common sense can operate, where then we can talk about, well, we all agree, we care about injustice and combating it. And so that's the most important thing. They don't, obviously, they're bad. I think both sides are bad. I genuinely think both sides are bad. And I think centrism is worse. And that's the missing part so far, is that centrism is worse than either side, because it tends to take the worst thing ever, which was the age before duopoly extremism. It takes duopoly consensus and tries to bring it back into our current reality. And that's not going to work either. Biden sort of tried, it wasn't going to work. We're over that. This is the age of duopoly extremism. There is no going back, okay? The question is what would a new world look like? What would a new left look like? What would a new right look like? What would a new center look like? What would a new independent look like? What would a new institution look like? What would a new movement look like? What would a new party look like? Like, these are the real questions for us, and they're actual questions. The thing about a real question and not a rhetorical question is that when I ask it, I don't have the answer. That's a real question. And genuine questions are worse, way worse than these rhetorical ones, because there is no real solution. We're actually responsible, insofar as we're radical and we want large-scale structural change, for figuring that out. And if these are genuine questions concerning real problems, then it's probably not going to be so simple. And for the people who do act like it's so simple, and they can just point at a history book, or they can just point at the previous century, and they can just act like nothing's really changed, we can kind of just like look at each other and say, let's keep moving forward. Let's not worry about those people, because those people are not in touch with the actual situation here on the ground, or they're enabling it and doing so for supposedly pragmatic reasons, when in reality, they're being opportunists or cowards or both. Thank you. That's the lecture. Oh, okay. Well, that feels good. Feels good to have that done. And so that's part 12 of the core concepts course, the fundamental problems and core concepts of theory underground. I didn't frame it as here's a fundamental problem and this is therefore the core concept. It would be easy to go back and do it, where you say the gerrymandering of Befindlichkeit and duopoly extremism, that is the problem, and politically non-binary, that is the solution. I'm not going to do it that way, because I'm not saying everyone needs to be politically non-binary. I'm just saying if people want to understand me or how to work with me, you probably want to understand that. So, you can be left, you can be right, you can be neither. But insofar as you want to have an intelligible conversation with me or get where I'm coming from, you got to understand everything that I just said. And then there's a lot of other stuff that I kind of cut out from this because I just thought I want to keep it tight. But if there's any thread in particular that you thought that I left hanging somewhere and I need to tie it up, let me know. And if there's any question in particular, it's kind of, even if it seems like a dumb question, it's probably not in this case. Like guaranteed, there's going to be some questions about this. And so, yeah, anything.
Yeah, thanks for the lecture. At a certain point, um, in the section on like the loser fascism and the winner fascism, uh, you said it works a lot. Like the word work came up a lot. It works for something, this duopoly. It has some sort of pragmatic almost quality. Um, can you maybe, does this fit how you think about it? Or
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't want to separate the two kinds of it works, because on the one side, what works um, with winner fascism obviously is just like it's the majority, what has historically worked. Catholicism historically worked in Italy. And obviously that's not what you're asking about. So I want to separate that from what works for duopoly consensus or duopoly extremism. In either of these cases, the idea is that power for corporate capitalism, state capitalism, whatever you want to call it, this particular phase of global capital, concentrated in the United States for now, but in reality, it's dispersed. That status quo, it's very complicated, right? And it requires a lot of people being on board, or if they're disaffected, not being able to unify. And so it works to keep people divided in the very most simple sense. But then it also works to mean that when people do attempt to change things, they channel that movement energy into either sides, sort of into the register of left or right. It's like, oh, well, I see no hope in a movement that's doing this, so we should probably channel that energy this way. Of course, maybe your fundamental predisposition makes it so that that side looks like the lesser evil, because you, for instance, maybe just think that abortion is infanticide. And so it's like, well, obviously I couldn't be on the other side. And so what that means is then you side with the lesser evil of the right wing, right? And the thing is in terms of keeping people divided, I'm focused on America because, this is the United States. It's the spectacle against which everyone compares themselves. And it's also where, for the time being, supposedly power is concentrated. And so for large-scale structural change to occur, unless it is magically, somehow, something awesome is going to happen coming from some other place, and that has like this crazy change for everything, it's likely that that change would have to come from the US. Okay, well, 50% of the US doesn't vote. 50% doesn't vote. So the legitimation narrative for the United States and for its imperial expansion is democracy. But at the point that it doesn't have literally half of the country choosing a side that is being offered, that's when the time has come for change. People are going to want change. People are paying attention, seeing if there's any real possibility for change, right? But the way that people get distracted from this is just like, oh yeah, well, the path forward would be this either technocratic or populist approach to either the left or the right. And what I just did by saying technocratic or populist or left or right is I created this little political compass that then divides up anyone who is going to get off the couch and go do things. So now you've got the bifurcation of a bifurcation of a bifurcation. Okay. So you've got people who are saying, oh, well, the change is going to have to come from the left. Well, okay, well, the only people who are actually voting on the left are going to be a quarter of the country. And what percentage of the people belonging to that quarter of the country actually show up for primaries or go knock on doors and make phone calls? It's less than 8%. So that's like a very small margin of the people. And then those people, the fact that they're knocking on doors and making phone calls, means that those are like the most activated people. But then because it's so captured within the whole thing, this is what Baudrillard would call pseudo-activity, or it's hyperactive. It's hyperactivity because you're doing a lot, and but yeah, you're replaceable. Anyone could do it. If you stop doing it, the same person's still going to win the presidency. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really make a huge difference. You spend a lot of time interfacing with the public, getting to know your neighbors, having conversations with people, all within the frame of duopoly extremism or duopoly consensus reality, right? And so, knocking on doors and making phone calls for Bernie definitely gave me a sense for America. I went to other states and did it, both in 2016 and 2020. And it was like, oh, this was a great way to meet people, right? Because I had a lot in common with the people I was doing it with. And I also kind of got to a sense for the public and what people are like. And so it's not completely frivolous, but if you really zoom out, it's just participating in, playing into this thing that requires any possible movement energy to get siphoned off into ever increasing pathways that sort of cause reaction, like predictable. That's, I think, maybe one of the things I left out about the cybernetic dialectic of mutually exclusive opposites that require their opposition to be its absolute worst. The reaction is predictable. When you take your children to a strip show and film it, the reaction is scripted and predictable. You know that you're going to get, oh, what's the problem? What's the big deal? From the people who can't see the problem and don't think it's a big deal. And you know that those people get off on triggering people who would have a problem with it, which is, once again, most people. So, what works is essentially the divide and conquer thing. And then I can say the other thing, which is slightly, it's not superficial, it's just kind of obvious. And that's just that, for the most wealthy families and corporations that obviously, try to build their capital, the culture war is like, it's not a joke. It's very serious. Like if you're a right wing kind of rich person, like that does have very real repercussions within your own family. Just look at Elon Musk with like a trans child and like, you just got to kind of, with all of his ex-wives, you can just imagine how contentious things are. And it's like no less true if you're like Bill Gates, right? Like or like if you're the Clintons, right? Guess what? Not everybody in the Clinton family is going to be progressive. There's going to be more conservative people. There's going to be more communist people. Like families are divided. It's not like everyone in a family is going to agree on everything, right? The culture war is very real within the family or within the C-suite of a corporation. The culture war is very real. But obviously, like the consensus reality, the true consensus reality, the unspoken consensus reality is that everything needs to basically stay the same. Like basically the same. Like, if we lose our way and there's all, and we're progressives and then, that means that we lose our way. So like a ton of people get deported or there's a whole bunch of tariffs or something like that. It's like, yeah, but there's obvious coming back from that, and it's still going to be the same basic reality. And most of the same corporations are still going to exist. Most of the same capital is going to exist. Most of the same extreme wealth inequality is still going to exist. And if I want to emphasize wealth inequality in class, I also want to emphasize state power. That doesn't change. It doesn't change. It doesn't matter if it's Biden or if it's Trump or if it's Obama or if it's Clinton or if it's Bush. The state power thing stays the same. And the military expansionism stays the same. And so whether we're talking about a welfare state, about a Marxist super nanny state, or about sort of austerity neoliberal state, these are all just ways of pushing the gas or brake pedals on this vehicle that requires things to basically be the way that they are. So, that the answer then is just like divide and conquer for the sake of keeping things basically the way that they are, which is obviously unsustainable.
Okay, yeah. So what changed for the system to come up with this new like strategy? Why all of a sudden do we move from this like more manageable, or maybe not more but this less intense, less extreme duopoly to this more extreme duopoly? Is this a consequence of like technological development, or I don't know?
The obvious
Does it
answer,
matter even what's really the maybe this?
maybe not. Maybe it doesn't matter, but it does seem like it's probably a combination of different things. One of them being there is no longer um, a Cold War with Soviet Russia, and that was like the major, thing that created the consensus reality. Um, we're also post 2008 financial crisis, and so the sort of general neoliberal consensus broke apart on that as well, right? Um, and then yeah, the medium changed, and so I just touched on political, economic, global reasons, but then the medium is no joke, and that changed as well.
Yeah. Does it have to do with like voter turnout also? Maybe I don't know what's in the US. Like, is the for, what I know is that like voter turnout is always like around 50% in the USA. Has been for a long time. So I wouldn't guess that it's like also maybe a way of like getting people to vote or trying to re-legitimate the democracy of sorts.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know.
like
I maybe heard Benjamin Studebaker say this somewhere. Like right now, the tactic is to get like docile people to maybe get to voting, or at least this is what the parties try to do. And maybe a tactic is like going to extremes and maybe also single issue extremes, so people get activated to maybe let's vote. But I don't know if this is really like maybe this is also just a consequence of this further structural thing.
yeah. I think I've underemphasized the reality of that side as well, where it's like you want people to get out and vote. And you also want people to come out and pay or donate to your nonprofit. And so the whole the whole the whole thing is activate people, wake them up, red pill them, or get them to become woke. In either case, it's like wake up, wake up, wake up to the reality. Yeah. And there's also like the legitimation side of it. It's like the political party feels more legitimate if it has more people, the nonprofit, it's doing very important work if more people are paying into it. So it's just like, yeah, people get their sense of value from having that supposed popular mandate. And just think about how Trump, like sitting there signing all of those executive orders, was all done under the auspices of having the popular mandate. And it's just like, yes, he did have the popular mandate because he won like everything. If you just look at the map, like all of these places that were like really close, they could have gone one way or the other, they all tipped right. Like the overwhelming majority of them did. Okay. But is it really popular mandate when it's still just like 26% of the country? Come on. That's not popular mandate. 50% of the country was like so despairing that night, you know, and then like a good quarter of the country was just like outraged and then depressed. So yeah, that's just it's almost 75% of the country was against it. But then he gets to claim that he has a popular mandate. And when you look at the voting map, it does look like that. Hey, there were more black people voting for Trump than ever before. There were more Mexican voters for Trump than ever before. These things were all true because it went up like 3% in each case. Like, what are we talking about? Like, it's so funny how statisticians are able to paint this picture of reality, you know. Yeah, the worst evil is that both sides need each other to be their own worst versions of themselves. And then they both get off on being the worst version of themselves and then they justify it by saying that they are the lesser evil. And then people who think that they're intellectually, theoretically above all that still play into and naturally sort of just side with usually the left, usually, right? Unless they're like, well, that's so far gone. Maybe we can do something with the right. And it's just like, it's not going to work, guys. Yeah, and that was the direction that the post left went. The post left was like, I mean, the direction of the post left is after Bernie, you just start to watch a lot of Tucker Carlson and you sit around with your friends at Dime Square and you talk about how you would go for build the wall, Medicare for all. That's a great slogan. Build the wall, Medicare for all. Right? Makes total sense. And then the more extreme version of it is I read Nazis and I read communists. I'm a red brown now. That was a real thing too. And so, that was when Benjamin Studebaker left What's Left podcast. And when Amy Therese kind of flies off the handle and goes into just leaning into the extremes. First, she's post left, then she's anti left. She's always just reacting, reacting, reacting. Benjamin, completely burnt out. Where does he go? Cambridge, gets a PhD, writes a book about how the way is shut. Just completely like, well, now what? There's no way. We're never going to get the Medicare for all. Whereas on the other side, Amy Therese is like, we will get the Medicare for all from Trump. Like that was the post-left trajectory, which just didn't have any staying power. It just became a bunch of socialites yapping on podcasts. It became Red Scare. And, in its more still left, technically, variant, it was either just dirtbag left, Chapo Trap House, or it was at the most extreme, sort of just idiocy, but having fun at least, Come Town. And that was the scene. And I was just like, that's not going to work, guys. It's just like, I didn't want to go get a PhD. I didn't want to go start a post-left podcast. I didn't want to hang out with those people because it's just a road to nowhere. That doesn't mean I don't watch Tucker. I will watch Tucker every once in a while. I will listen to someone. If he has a guest on, I'm not going to not listen to him. He's actually a really good interviewer, right? And part of the reason he's such a good interviewer is because he kind of has that like extremely confused face, and people love to open up to a really confused face, which I don't know if you guys have ever paid attention, but I do that face also in my own interviews with people because it gets them talking. I just go, and it really gets them talking. You just ask them questions and kind of have that face, and people love to talk. And it works for him, and it works for Joe Rogan too. And realizing that both sides suck, you realize that means that you can literally get your news from everywhere. The post-left thing was just to only get their news from the right. And for me, post-duopoly means you just try to get it everywhere and be critical of everyone at the same time. And sometimes you just kind of have to dip out and not pay attention for a few months because you got to try to, you can't let yourself be too captured by that. And so it's like, yeah, watch Breaking Points. Totally. You've got a great couple of people with Breaking Points trying to, represent more populist, anti-institutional left and right positions and then talk about what's current. Great. Yeah, go for it. But also like, you probably just need to take a break from the news for like, a month to 6 months every once in a while if you want to actually be doing theory and meeting real people and getting off of your phone, right? At the end of the day, it's not going to help you plant a garden. It's not going to help you read Plato or Deleuze. It's not going to help you actually organize with anybody. It's not going to help you meet anybody worth actually dating, much less getting married to, especially not having children with. And so, it's ultimately like the whole news thing and the reacting to it, and then becoming a socialite within a scene of people whose personalities are the news that they consume and the takes that they come up with in relation to that news. Like, that's just like not the path, is kind of the realization that I came to. Luke said this lecture was sponsored by Ground News. Yeah. Audible. It's sponsored by Audible. Yeah, no. All right, guys, I'm going to close out now unless Federico or Ao, you got something? No? No? All right, guys, thank you so much. And catch you on the flip side. 2026. Merry Christmas. Peace. All right, now that it's over, I'm back. What's up, everybody? So if you are interested in getting your hands on this post-duopoly de-radicalization starter pack that is sort of the call to action here at the end, well, I have the link. Ask me about it directly. I'll share it with you. And let's start talking about the local group you plan participating in or organizing, where these books are going to be something that you read 1 month at a time. I think the first in the series is Reclaiming Conversation by Sherry Turkle. And the second one is Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank. And then there's levels to it, as I said. And it's going to just get more and more interesting as the year proceeds. But we got to lay some of the basics. And laying that basis really is, I think, all about trying to onboard people in your life who might be progressives or liberals or leftists, or just sort of like normies or independents who kind of have you pegged as being something like that. But then you're like, hey, I'm doing something else, guys. I'm actually doing something else. That's what this is all about. But in the process, you'll actually meet all kinds of really cool people in your local area. And then you'll have much more interesting conversations with us, with me and Tony and everybody else participating on the back end here at Theory Underground. So with that said, reach out to me direct to get that link. And welcome to Intro to Theory. Excited to see you in class. Okay, take care.